always a few episodes of some great shows that most fans will argue show off the best of it. But sometimes those episodes require you to be familiar with the show in order to fully appreciate it. And it seems rare for shows to have episodes that even people not so familiar with it can enjoy almost, if not just as much as someone who is familiar with it. So now, I'm setting out to find the episodes that do manage to accomplish this feat and hold them in the highest regard of all cartoon episodes in this new segment I'm calling Familiar versus Not So Familiar. And what better way to start off this new segment than with the famous Gumball episode, The Choices. Now I'm still fairly new to the Amazing World of Gumball, having only seen the first season, and I'm bringing on one of the biggest Gumball fans in the entire world to discuss this episode with me. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only C.R. Martin.
Greetings and salutations, everyone. Or, as we say in the Philippines, mabuhay! A pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me over, Jem.
Thanks for joining me, and I'm sure you're especially excited with this episode we're discussing today, as you've done a video on it yourself, right?
That I have.
To summarize this episode, it's about Nicole, the mother character of the series, questioning how her life became what it is, what with a moronic husband and crazy-ass kids, and thinks back to the day she met her husband, Richard, and contemplates what her life would have been like had she made other choices that day. And the episode shows us how those choices would have panned out. Now, speaking as the one familiar with this show, Martin, my question for you is, do you think this show goes overboard to the point where newcomers will be getting the absolute best of this show, and as a result, other episodes will seem too inferior?
Well, I don't know about overboard, but I do indeed hold the choices in high regard. For a newcomer to the Amazing World of Gumball, this is a fairly accessible episode in that they can watch it without any prior knowledge on the series and still appreciate its empirical qualities. But they won't get as much out of it as someone who is well versed in the show, as a fair amount of the episode does rely on context. For instance, anyone who hasn't seen Gumball before, or at least seen very little of it, might be confused or even put off by the behavior that Gumball, Darwin, Anais, and Richard exhibit in the episode.
I guess that depends on how little we're talking here. Even though this is the only episode I've seen past the first season, I saw more than enough of these characters to still be entertained by their behaviors. Though, I will say if I'd only watched the first few episodes and then moved on to the choices, their behaviors more than likely would have taken me a bit out of the magic this episode was trying to create. That being said, what really drew me in with this episode was its exploration of Nicole, revealing more of her background and what she went through. And with it being the introduction to Nicole's parents, who actually play a big role in this episode, it manages to let you see what Nicole was living with, whether you're familiar with her or not. And I have to say, it was impressively done.
It was, yes. The best part about Nicole's portrayal in this episode is that it's much like her portrayal in The Fury. Both these episodes take her badass and down-to-earth qualities and evolve them beyond idiosyncrasies, with neither aspect overshadowing the other. They show Nicole being awesome and how she became that way. That being said, I found that The Fury leans a little bit more towards the awesome aspects, while The Choices seems more geared towards the relatable ones, and that gives more of an edge to the latter in terms of being more impactful.
That's true. This episode mostly focuses on why certain choices you may regret not making might not have always resulted in the better outcome, and that's why it's best not to dwell on them. And the way this episode shows this are not just creative, but also very real. Yeah, they're cartoony and all, but they're not exactly unrealistic possibilities, and they play towards the type of dark humor that very few shows seem to get correct. Unlike certain episodes like, say, A Pal for Gary from SpongeBob, which tries to work in dark humor with absolutely no regard to how it fits with the character, this episode messes with Nicole's characteristics in a way that makes sense. Because she's experiencing a totally different life based off one small choice, her personality manifests based off the scenario she puts herself in. And each time it builds up to the point where it's no surprise she'd finally snap.
So, how do you like the sushi? It took me hours.
It's cold.
Let me heat it up for you. Is that hot enough for you? Is it hot enough?
I also want to add that since the episode is largely comprised of a flashback and different hypothetical outcomes, it has much more leeway with what it can do with Nicole. This is different from something like the aforementioned A Pal for Gary, where the character is portrayed this way with past portrayals and developments in mind. And on that note, it'd also be different if this were present-day Nicole, with her own concrete characteristics and past development, in which case, yes, it would be a massive slap in the face and a total disregard for continuity.
Speaking of character continuity, I gotta ask, does Gumball follow continuity? Cause based off the first season, the show didn't seem to follow it that closely, so I'm curious if it plays a role in this episode.
Yes, Gumball has continuity in it, and despite it being a mainly episodic show, its continuity is actually interesting and well done. I even think it's better than Steven Universe's continuity. What? You wanna go? You wanna go? We can go right now! Come on! I apologize for my unprofessionalism. For one of such class as myself, this is unbecoming of me. I'll be better for the rest of the video.
Anyway, let's get down to the final thing we'll be looking at to determine if this episode is something you can enjoy equally as well, despite your familiarities with the show. Because of how much of a role it plays in the episode, how good of a job do you think it did showing off the bond that forms between Richard and Nicole?
I believe the episode did a superb job with developing the relationship. We've seen a strong enough catalyst for this development in the form of past developments in older episodes. And yes, this includes the oh-so-dreadful The Hero. Nicole and Richard have been shown to be as wildly different as they are close to each other in the past, and it all comes to a head in this episode, which I should remind you is largely a flashback. This effectively answers a number of aching questions surrounding their relationship, like what does she see in him, or how far back do they go?
And those are questions even those who aren't familiar with this show ask. Even though I've seen very little of this show, the majority of the episodes I've seen, it's hard not to wonder what their history is. I mean, the only real glimpse I got of it was in the Gi when—
Wow, you actually pronounced it right this time.
Yeah, well, when dozens of comments are telling you the proper pronunciation, it's hard not to take the hints. Anyway, in the Gi, there's a little glimpse into their past that shows Nicole standing up for Richard for not being afraid to be himself despite the ridicules of others. And as sweet as it is, it doesn't exactly reveal why she holds him in such a high regard. And even if you're looking at it as just a funny pairing, that excuse can only go so far before the writers have to address it. And not in a funny flashback joke like in The Wands. And once you start to see how and why they became the better halves of each other, it all starts to become clear.
What would you do if you were me?
If I had done everything you've done, sleep till I'm 40.
I mean, what should I do with my life?
Maybe start living it?
And it all culminates into a wonderful and yet still somewhat funny parody of the opening scene from Up, which is something I actually am familiar with and can fully appreciate. So it not only hits you hard like Up did, it hits you in a way that still feels new, and that's because it's doing it in its own style.
That's actually the same sentiment I have. One thing that needs to be said about Derivation: there's no harm in drawing inspiration from a pre-existing work of art, so long as you can make your own interpretation distinct enough that it stands out on its own two legs. See, the Gumball crew knows how well done the opening 10 minutes of Up were, and they took the best aspects of that opening, from the film grain and sepia tone to Ben Lockett's incredible piano piece, and gave it the unique Gumball branded flavor to set it apart from the famous 2009 Disney Pixar movie. And their take on an emotionally charged sequence is just as competent and masterful, if I say so myself.
So, final thoughts about this being considered the best episode of the series. Would you agree with that sentiment? And do you think people who are unfamiliar with this show will find it almost, if not just as enjoyable as people who are familiar with it?
I agree with that sentiment for both creative and personal reasons. The Choices hits a lot of high notes, both expected and unexpected, and all from different perspectives, be they comedic or dramatic. It answers many questions that needed to be answered, while also leaving behind new questions for viewers to fondly ponder on. In a technical sense and a narrative one, the episode goes above and beyond what longtime viewers like myself have expected from the show, drawing inspiration from some of the best of animated cinema and translating it beautifully into an 11-minute format. Ben Bocale didn't need to resort to focus groups or other similar evaluations to find what works. He put together something that was personal and intimate to him, with the Wattersons being caricatures of his own life, and made something that he, and by extension his audience, could relate to, knowing that what works best is what one knows best. And guess what? It works, regardless of whether you're a Gumball scholar or a Gumball newcomer.
And I have to agree with you. Even though I'm still new to this show, and even though this episode is miles ahead of most Season 1 episodes, as an animation fan, there's so much to appreciate with it. Whether it's executing dark humor in ways it works best, working in life lessons just enough to where they don't feel like they completely take over, and still keeping itself grounded as a cartoon, yet still touching on the topics of dwelling on the past and always wondering what if. It's hard for me to say I wouldn't recommend this episode to someone who wasn't into the show. While I would say a little familiarity with the show would probably make it that much better, I still feel someone who's completely unfamiliar with the show, yet still an avid watcher of cartoons, would be hard-pressed not to enjoy this episode. Well, thank you for joining me for the first installment of Familiar versus Not So Familiar. It was a pleasure having you on the show, and it was a pleasure to see your love for this show come out.
Not a problem at all, fine sir. It's refreshing to be able to find more people getting into Gumball and who I can discuss it with. Now, if only I can convert a certain edgelord into Gumballism.
Edgelord. I wonder if I could get someone like that on my channel someday. Well, anyway, thank you all for watching, and...
Oh, can I say it?
What?
Can I say it? Please? I've always wanted to say your outro on your video.
Okay, I don't see why not.
Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next review.
Wow, that was good.
Thanks. Now to catch my flight. Oh, and you've got one to catch too. Don't forget it, babe.
This explains so much!
It's not every day that an episode of any TV show comes along bringing about a significant personal impact on me. And thinking about my love for Gumball right now has given me the urge to talk about what is undoubtedly its best episode.